Okay, and what does it feel like to have COVID when you're not vaccinated at all? Well, you're looking at it. Welcome to the Godward Show. I'm your host, Casey. And this is kind of a special episode. It's not really about the books as usual, but we're going to kind of continue on this theme of authority and the law. And, just continue drilling down into it. I've watched a number of movies over the year. And by the way, if anybody has any recommendations for other movies on the same theme, I would be so interested in hearing them. The difficult problem that I'm trying to present to my viewers lately is the one we call the problem of authority. And the difficulty is in judging when and whether certain kinds of refusals or rebellions are justified. By the way, you should probably watch this one on 1.5x. If you're not usually into that, try it on this episode, because I am feeling a little, you might say, like I need a nap, But when are these refusals or rebellions justified? And in my view, it works the same way, whether the authority we're considering is secular or religious. We have countless examples of both sorts of institutions becoming corrupt or sliding into error. So my goal is not to strawman the authority figures, but to consider the question by way of principles. What circumstances and qualifications must be met before a rebellion against established authority is considered just? Now, those of us who were raised American will undoubtedly think near the top of our list of Jefferson's wording in the Declaration of Independence. So from the second paragraph, he says, quote, "Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them, to the people, shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government, and to provide new guards for their future security." End quote. But of course, we live in interesting times, right? I mean, I understand that many of you think Jefferson now was like a big mistake, and that modernity in general was a mistake, and that freedom is bad, and that the American Revolution was just, organized treason. A better example, then, might be to consider the first, by the way, I'm going to get to the movies here, but this is the frame job, right? That a better example might be to consider the first book of Maccabees, which is actually included in your Catholic Bibles, if I'm not mistaken, as an example of how this question can be very difficult to decide. The difficulty exists because of that one line from Paul in Romans 13, where he urges the people to obey the ruling authorities. I mean, this becomes a sort of usable doctrine, one that conveniently never existed in Judaism, and is basically always just deployed against Christians whenever they start to demand good government, All of the conflicts described in the Bible and by historians between this singular people, the Jews, and, Pharaoh, Haman, Nebuchadnezzar, Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, Claudius, Titus, Hadrian, to name a few, can certainly be understood as examples where God's people are decidedly not to submit to the ruling authorities. So, for instance, we can read in 1 Maccabees chapter 1, quote, "Antiochus now issued a decree that all nations in his empire should abandon their own customs and become one people. All the Gentiles and even many of the Israelites submitted to this decree. They adopted the official pagan religion, offered sacrifices to idols, and no longer observed the Sabbath. And the clear teaching here is that, needless to say, that's bad, right? And whatever authority Antiochus may have had was nullified by his decree and, similar violations that I think that first or second chapter of Maccabees mentions. It would be a worthwhile project to try to get really into the weeds on this question and to sort out exactly what dynamics in relation between citizen subjects and the ruling authorities, and figure out what dynamics kind of justify rebellion. You might think that these are flat-out egregious cases, and that what happened with Antiochus and Judah Maccabee was a good example of that, of the example where the rebellion is justified. But I propose that it's rarely that clean-cut and simple. In fact, I suspect that most of Greece would have sided with Antiochus, who, after all, from a different narrative POV, was just trying to keep his empire from factioning and falling apart. Perhaps this reinforces the point that I try to make from time to time about how history doesn't actually even exist. It's always already propaganda, in the sense that every narration of what happened relies on some foundational value judgments in order to bring sense to the chaos of incidents. I'm about to get to the movies, but just one more note from my dissertation on Moby Dick, the chapter on Moby Dick, to help make this point clearer. Beneath the institutionally authorized hierarchy of rank, Melville imagines a natural order of rank. Quoting Melville, "When a person, placed in command over his fellow men, finds one of them to be very significantly his superior in general pride of manhood, straightway against that man he conceives an unconquerable dislike and bitterness, and if he have a chance, he will pull down and pulverize that subaltern's tower, and make a little heap of dust of it." For Melville, this is the aspect of human nature that works to incite the rebellious spirit, turning an otherwise just authority into a target. This problem of individuals within institutional systems refusing to play their part is at the foundation of Melville's often ambiguous and contradictory political thinking. And the point is that human psychology is always involved in these rebellious reactions. Every rebellion begins with a kind of discomfort that grows in some individuals until it becomes intolerable. And it doesn't hit everybody the same time, right? Judah Maccabee hated the idea of the statue in the temple. But that same chapter in 1 Maccabees records, quote, "At that time there appeared in the land of Israel a group of traitorous Jews who had no regard for the law and who had a bad influence on many of our people. They said, 'Let's come to terms with the Gentiles, for our refusal to associate with them has brought us nothing but trouble.' This proposal appealed to many people, and some of them became so enthusiastic about it that they went to the king and received from him permission to follow Gentile customs." So we could easily imagine some gaslighter saying, why did Judah Maccabee just practice stoicism? Why didn't he just practice stoicism, right? Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Put up with it. Just stay in his lane. Why were so many of his countrymen able to submit, whereas he couldn't stand it? When I was an undergraduate psychology major, everyone knew the Milgram Experiment because it reinforced the narrative, at the time, at least, right? This was back in the late 90s, early 2000s or so. It reinforced the old narrative, that is to say. The bad guys were still the white, patriarchal, crypto-fascists back then. Milgram dreamed up the experiment, he has said, after listening to much testimony taken from the Nuremberg trials, where people explained their participation in the war crimes by speaking of obedience. My boss told me to. So the way it worked, this experiment, the Milgram Experiment, was simple. Volunteers were offered $4.50 an hour of their time to come to the Yale lab. They were introduced to another participant who was actually in on the experiment with Milgram himself. And then they drew straws, supposedly to determine their role as either a learner or a teacher, but of course it was fixed, so that all of the unsuspecting volunteers found themselves in the role of teachers. After meeting the teacher-learner, the learner would then be sent to an adjacent room and supposedly strapped to a chair and fastened with electrodes. From the other room, the teacher is tasked with reading some sets of words, and supposedly the learner will recite the words back in the same order. And when the learner gets the words wrong, the teacher is to administer a shock from a board with switches ranging from 15 volts to 450 volts. The last one I remember is marked danger, severe shock. So, of course, the real experiment was to see if and when the teachers would refuse to continue participating. So, as the shock values increased, the actor learners on the other side of the wall started expressing discomfort, and then pain, and then agony. Ow, or this hurts, or my heart is going to give out, or let me the hell out of here, Whenever the teacher hesitated or tried to refuse to go on, the experimenter, dressed in a lab coat, was given 4 verbal replies to cycle through. First, he would say, "Please continue." Then, if the learner continued objecting, he would say, "The experiment requires you to continue." And then he said, "It is absolutely essential that you continue." And if further objections, he would say, "You have no other choice but to continue." Now, depressingly, 65% of participants continued to the highest level of 450 volts, even after the screams of the learner had stopped, suggesting that he either fainted or was dead. Milgram ran 18 variations on the experiment. For example, one of them, a lab coat guy, the guy who's the administrator of the experiment, the lab coat guy, receives a phone call at the beginning of the experiment and is replaced by a street clothes observer. Obedience in that case fell from 65% to 20%, suggesting, obviously, that the white lab coat is, in our culture, let's see, what should I say here? A sign of authority, to say the least, right? If not like a hypnotic spell cast on all of us. In a 1974 article titled "The Perils of Obedience," Milgram wrote, "The legal and philosophical aspects of obedience are of enormous import, but they say very little about how most people behave in concrete situations. I set up a simple experiment at Yale University to test how much pain an ordinary citizen would inflict on another person simply because he was ordered to by an experimental scientist. Stark authority was pitted against the subjects, or the participants' strongest moral imperatives against hurting others, and with the subjects' ears ringing with the screams of the victims, authority won more often than not. The extreme willingness of adults to go to almost any lengths on the command of an authority constitutes the chief finding of the study, and the fact most urgently demanding explanation." I suppose it's a pretty self-explanatory study. I don't know that I have to say much more, and I think it's an important one. Yes, it was basically a product of, post-World War II hysterics about authority, and yes, it was the kind of thing that seemed to be born in the 1960s hippie culture. But if you've been yelled at by a Trader Joe's greeter who is making $11 an hour to put on your mask, it should feel relevant in 2021. Okay, now, very related to that, the 2012 movie, written and directed by Craig Zobel, starring Dreama Walker, Ann Dowd, and Pat Healy. Let's talk about it. The movie was based, and by the way, my movie reviews here, obviously I'm going through these quickly. This is not exactly, Roger Ebert tier movie review. I'm really just sort of suggesting you take a watch at these if you want to consider further the question of authority in relation to, justified rebellion. So the movie was based on a string of real-life phone calls placed between about 1992 and 2004 in rural areas of the United States, in which the caller would phone a restaurant or a grocery store and claim to be a police officer. Then, when he could, I mean, sometimes this didn't work, but sometimes it did. He would convince the managers on the phone to strip search and, in other ways, degrade one of the employees. He would say, like, hi, this is so-and-so, officer so-and-so down at the precinct, and we're really busy, but I need you to, like, and then he would say, like, do you guys have a young blonde girl working at the front there? And you're like, yeah, I mean, who didn't in 1995 at a McDonald's, so it sounded as if he had a real target, but he was making it up, right? In the movie, it's a real rundown McDonald's in rural Kentucky. And the movie works so well because it's very quiet and direct. Almost every scene takes place in the back room of this McDonald's. And the casting, especially of the two female leads, is perfect. Dreama Walker plays sort of like a throwaway American teenager, and she does it great. She shows up for work, she does what she has to do to make a few bucks. I mean, that's it. She just works at McDonald's, and she plays that role of teenage McDonald's worker from the 1990s. She plays every emotion effectively, too, from the early, like, confusion, what is this? I didn't steal anything, when she's first accused by a random phone caller to the horror and, like, total degradation that follow when all the strip searching and stuff happens in the back room. And to make it all more unnerving, Ann Dowd is the perfect, schoolmarm lead who just takes orders from some rando on the phone who claims to be a cop. And like, there are these really creepy lines, for example, where the caller on the phone whispers to her in this creepy voice. He says things like, "Thanks so much for your help in this. We're really swamped down at the precinct. You're doing such a great job. It's almost like you're a real police officer yourself," and so on. And of course, this makes her, some dim-witted McDonald's manager, just like beam with pride, like, "Oh, thank you, I'm just trying to help." So later in the movie, she does begin to wonder and even hesitate, and she calls one of her acquaintances back into the back room with her, some guy who hangs out at McDonald's often. He proves to be worse than unhelpful, and eventually Becky, the young girl, who is being falsely accused, is coerced even into performing oral sex on the guy, and he and Ann Dowd end up like spanking her. It's all just ridiculous. Cavity searches and so on. It's all seriously hard to watch, and you just want to scream at the TV, "Stop obeying," or I guess, like, at least make the caller come to the McDonald's and prove his credentials, right? Which honestly is a pretty low bar for this kind of obedience. One thing this movie doesn't really address is about, the, like, sort of, like, about the, what about the actual authority of police? Like, for instance, what if a real policeman did this? Would that make it any different? I mean, many of you will remember those photos of the casual campus cop spraying pepper spray at student protesters a couple years ago. I mean, I guess somehow, according to local statutes, they have the right to do that kind of thing. But, like, sort of vaguely quoting Leo Strauss, do they have the natural right to do that kind of thing, I mean, is it right measured against eternity, I guess? And this is why it was good to discuss the martial rules, as we did in the last episode on Billy Budd. Because there, in that case, it's not just like one person whose conscience kind of goes quiet against contradicting moral concerns. Instead, Captain Veer upholds the law. Billy has to die so that the law maintains its authority, right? A very similar case occurred again in real life in 1789 on the HMS Bounty. A Royal Navy vessel was traversing the South Pacific, okay? It's a great Wikipedia read, by the way, and it's one of those stories that became a classic of maritime Western storytelling. It's been made into a movie at least 5 different times, but the one we're going to talk about is the one that starred St. Mel Gibson, of course, titled simply The Bounty. Wow, I'm afraid I'm going to die. The plot is basically a series of flashbacks set against a court-martial of Lieutenant William Bligh for losing his ship to mutineers. Now, because of the difficult winds, it takes the ship almost a year to arrive in Tahiti from its departure in Britain. And during that time, this is the flashback, right? And during that time, the crew begins to show signs of a breakdown in discipline, especially when they come into contact with the lovely and welcoming young island ladies. Bly, the lieutenant, tries to push back and enforce discipline. But this seems to worsen the problem. Now some of the men are determined to jump ship and stay on the islands. One of the sailors, the guy named Christian Fletcher, played by Mel Gibson, even married one of the locals, but eventually the lieutenant, played by Anthony Hopkins, forces the men back onto the ship for the long ride home. Resentment builds, but in response to the resentment, the lieutenant doubles down. He becomes tyrannical. And here the tension builds. The men are given all kinds of petty tasks to do, and no dissent is tolerated. Eventually, Fletcher and his co-conspirators arrest Lieutenant Bly and all who were loyal to him. They put him on one of the side boat ships, or the little, like the side boat ships, or boats, I don't know what they're called, and they set them adrift. Fletcher and his companions sail back to Tahiti, then, to be with their island wives. But it doesn't go very well. They're basically forced back to sea, and they kind of sail around looking for safe haven where the Royal Navy will never find them. Eventually, the crew becomes mad even at Fletcher, and they begin speaking of rebelling against him and taking the boat back to Tahiti. But he finds a harbor at Pitcairn Island in a place that he thinks isn't on the British maps. And then the men burn the ship, realizing they'll never return to Britain again. So then the scene cuts back to the court-martial. Lieutenant Bly is exonerated of responsibility and is even commended for his harrowing voyage in one of those little boats to get the men on that craft back home safely. The movie is good because it sustains the moral ambiguity that I like. Was Fletcher justified in his rebellion, or did he let his personal degeneracy, or his desire for the ladies, basically, undermine the good order that the Lieutenant Bly was trying to maintain? I'm not insensible to the possibility that Gibson's character really was out of line in this case, and in parts, the movie really does feel like sort of an allegory for questions concerning liberty and fascism and so on. And as a matter of fact, funny enough, Leo Strauss writes about this at the beginning of Natural Right and History. So since we're going to talk to Athenian Stranger this Friday on the Secret Stream, patrons, listen to this. Strauss says, quote, "To reject natural right is tantamount to saying that all right is positive right. And this means primarily that what is right is defined exclusively by the legislatures and the courts of the various countries. Now, it is obviously meaningful, and sometimes even necessary, to speak of unjust laws or unjust decisions. In passing such judgments, we imply that there is a standard of right and wrong independent of positive right, and higher than positive right, a standard with reference to which we are able to judge of positive right." End quote. So take a case like Billy Budd's, for example. Positive right is defined simply by the statutes and laws as they exist on the book. A man's freedoms, his responsibilities, are to be defined and codified by legislators. But there's nothing beyond that, nothing higher than that. But Strauss correctly, I think in this case, suggests that it is possible to imagine unjust legislators and unjust laws. And in that case, we have to speak of what he calls natural right, which is something that exists before legislation. Here, recall the kinds of language used by Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence that I read above. I read 3 or 4 relevant articles on the topic of unjust laws while I was thinking about this episode, but I couldn't really find anything great, other than maybe this little bit that seemed kind of useful. And it was a concluding paragraph from a Catholic Notre Dame professor written in 1995, where he says, quote, "There are a considerable number of other issues and considerations relevant to this general topic. There is civil disobedience, overt violation of laws which are perhaps themselves just laws, for the purpose of expressing one's protest against some other law or public policy which is closely associated with the law broken and is unjust. Then, there is the covert violation of laws, which, though generally just, protect and indirectly promote unjust activities unjustly permitted or promoted by law or public policy. For example, laws about trespass or damage to property in their application to extermination camps or abortia or embryo banks or nuclear missile bases. Then there is the private use of preventative force in circumstances where public officials unjustly refuse to use it. There is revolutionary activity and the use of force to overthrow governments which persist in upholding gravely unjust violations of human rights. There are uses of force to suppress revolutionary activity which is being undertaken with just cause, but without reasonable prospect of success, and therefore unjustifiably. And there are other questions which will become ever more evident and urgent matters for Christian and philosophical reflection and judgment as our democratic societies become more and more unjust under the color of right and the impulse of passions unleashed by secularism. End quote. And this all seems self-evidently true to me. At the same time, I can't go so far as to pledge unfailing fealty to the worldly institutions of any particular church, because I don't have the faith in institutions. But as I said in my last episode, you certainly can have that faith. And if you do, there's nothing inconsistent in saying, hey man, whatever the magisterium says, that's what I believe. But even aside from this fundamental question of how we come to totally trust in the authority of an institution, there will always remain the morally anomalous questions that are as yet unaddressed by, the catechism. Which things like, how should I use social media? Is it immoral to skip classes? Does God want me to wear a tie? And so on. And I'm not trying to make a joke here, but to suggest that these sorts of questions cannot but be answered by something like, personal judgment or discernment. I'd be really interested to read to read a story or watch a movie, as I said earlier, about this theme, about this kind of rebellion that takes place within established religious institutions in particular. So I mean a story other than the Gospels, because there's got to be a way to distinguish between Satan's rebellion against God and certain more moderate objections to the claims to religious authority that have been made at various times in history. Anyway, I don't want to rattle on forever here. You guys are starting to get the idea, but I do think it's important to think about the positions and titles that exist in institutions as being held by individuals who are subject to all the errors of judgment that any of us commonly are subject to. The question, who says so, can be annoying and even sassy when it's uttered by, your 11-year-old daughter. But there's always the possibility, it seems to me, that she might have a point, and discerning the difference. I'll throw Hebrews 5:11-14 up on your screens again as an outro image. Basically, you got to learn to think for yourselves beyond any codification of behavioral codes. That seems to me central to at least the Pauline Christian thinking. Okay, hey, thanks for listening. As I said, this Friday's secret stream session is going to be an interview with the very cool Twitter presence Athenian Stranger. If you'd like to ask him a question or hear the interview, consider signing up to support me on Patreon. Last thought. Yes, I think I have COVID. I got tested once and it was negative after my wife was positive for 5 days. But I do, like I said, I have kind of a headache. So I went and got the test again today with the thing in your nose. So hopefully it comes back positive, and then well, I don't know, because now it's like you have to get the thing even though you're immune. So it's interesting times, isn't it, gentlemen? It's like, boy, when would we rebel? Because not now, right? Not now. This is not bad enough. These are petty, small matters. You just can't have a job, or in some parts of the world, go outside, and so on. But not yet. We're still waiting for the moment, I guess. Okay, thanks for listening. Bye-bye.